Sometimes the deepest bonds are formed not with people, but with the animals who stand by us through life's hardest seasons. For 70-year-old cowboy Jed McAllister, his horse Duke had been more than a companion. He'd been family through decades of loneliness on a dying ranch. But lately, Duke was acting strange. Every evening, the old mustang would walk to the same spot and stare at the crumbling barn where Jed's father once worked. Night after night, Duke stood guard, his ears alert, his body tense, as if protecting some hidden secret. Jed had never seen anything like it in all his years with horses. The barn had been empty for decades, just rotting wood and memories. One moonlit night, Jed finally followed his horse's gaze and stepped inside. What he found buried beneath the floorboards was a discovery that would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire forgotten town. But why was Duke the only one who seemed to know what was hidden there? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of the McAllister Ranch, where Jed had spent the better part of his 70 years watching the world change around him. The land stretched out in all directions, endless and unforgiving, but it had been home to 3 generations of McAllisters. His grandfather had claimed this patch of earth back in 1892, and his father had worked it until the day he died. Now it was just Jed and Duke, 2 old souls making their way through what felt like the final chapter of a story that had begun long before either of them was born. The ranch house stood like a monument to better times, its once white paint now the color of old bones, peeling away in strips that curled and fell with each passing storm. The front porch sagged under the weight of decades, but Jed still took his morning coffee there every day, watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Duke would always be waiting by the fence, his dark eyes patient and knowing, as if he understood that these quiet moments were precious and few. Jed's hands, gnarled from years of honest work, wrapped around the warm ceramic mug that had been his father's. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way he'd learned to make it during those long winters when supplies ran low and neighbors were too far away to matter. He thought about those days often now, when the town of Cedar Falls had been something more than a collection of empty storefronts and faded dreams. Cedar Falls had once thrived on cattle and crops, a bustling community where families put down roots and children grew up expecting to follow in their parents' footsteps. The railroad had brought prosperity, and Main Street had been lined with businesses that served ranchers and farmers from miles around. Jed remembered when the general store stayed open until 8 in the evening, when the schoolhouse was full of laughter, and when Saturday nights brought folks together for dances that lasted until dawn. But that was before the drought of '89, before the railroad moved its depot 30 miles south to serve the growing cities, before the young people started leaving for opportunities that couldn't be found in a place where the wind never stopped blowing and the horizon never seemed to get any closer. Now Cedar Falls was home to maybe 50 souls, most of them too old or too stubborn to start over somewhere else. Jed finished his coffee and set the mug on the porch rail, a ritual that marked the beginning of another day's work. Duke lifted his head at the sound, ears forward, ready for whatever tasks lay ahead. They had developed an understanding over the years, man and horse, built on respect and the kind of trust that only comes from facing hardship together. Duke had been a gift from Jed's father on his 40th birthday. Every man needs a partner he can count on, the old man had said, and 30 years later, that wisdom had proven itself true in ways his father couldn't have imagined. The barn loomed in the distance, its red paint long since faded to the color of dried blood. It had been the heart of the ranch once, filled with hay and grain, tools and equipment, the accumulated wealth of a family that had worked hard and planned for the future. Jed's father had built it with his own hands, every board and nail placed with the care of a man who understood that what he built today would shelter tomorrow's dreams. But the barn had been empty for more years than Jed cared to count. The hay had been sold off or rotted away, the equipment had broken down or been sold to pay bills, and the dreams had faded like everything else on the ranch. Now it stood as a reminder of what used to be, its doors hanging open, like a mouth frozen in a permanent yawn of disappointment. Jed walked down the porch steps, his boots making hollow sounds on the worn wood. Duke approached the fence, his movement still graceful despite his age, and Jed reached out to stroke the horse's neck. The animal's coat was the color of rich earth, marked with the scars of a life lived outdoors, but his eyes still held the intelligence and spirit that had made him special from the beginning. "Morning, old friend," Jed said, his voice carrying the gentle roughness of a man who spent more time talking to animals than people. "Ready for another day?" Duke nickered softly, a sound that seemed to carry all the understanding that words couldn't express. They had work to do, fences to mend, water troughs to check, the endless tasks that kept a ranch running, even when it wasn't really running anymore. But first, Jed needed to make his weekly trip into town for supplies, and Duke would have to wait. The drive to Cedar Falls took 15 minutes on roads that had seen better decades. Jed's pickup truck, a 1995 Ford that had outlasted 3 paint jobs and countless repairs, rattled and wheezed its way past empty fields and abandoned homesteads. Each mile marker was a memorial to families who had given up the fight, and Jed sometimes wondered if he was the last fool stubborn enough to keep trying. Martha Henley's general store occupied the corner of Main and First, a 2-story brick building that had been the commercial heart of Cedar Falls for over a century. Martha herself was approaching 80, her silver hair always perfectly arranged, her smile warm despite the hardships that had taken most of her customers away. She had been his father's friend, and now she was one of the few people left who remembered when the McAllister name meant something in these parts. "Morning, Jed," she called from behind the counter as he entered, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with the same cheerful tone it had used for 50 years. "Duke doing well?" "Well enough," Jed replied, though he didn't mention the strange behavior that had been puzzling him for weeks. "Need the usual supplies, Martha. Coffee, sugar, some of that soap that doesn't make my hands crack." Martha moved with the efficient grace of someone who had been stocking shelves and serving customers since before Jed was born. She knew exactly what he needed, had probably prepared his order before he walked through the door. That was the way things worked in a small town. People took care of each other because they were all each other had. "Found something you might be interested in," Martha said, reaching beneath the counter and producing a leather-bound journal that looked older than both of them. "Was cleaning out the back room and came across this. Belonged to your father, I think. Must have left it here years ago, and I just never thought to return it." Jed took the journal with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. The leather was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age, but he recognized his father's handwriting on the cover, E. McAllister, 1987. Edward McAllister had been a man of few words, but those words had always carried weight. Finding his journal felt like discovering a piece of the past that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to resurface. "Thank you, Martha," Jed said, his voice quieter than usual. "I'll take good care of it. I know you will," she replied, her eyes soft with understanding. "Your father was a good man, Jed. Whatever troubles he carried them so others wouldn't have to." The drive home seemed longer than usual, the journal sitting on the passenger seat, like a passenger who had been waiting decades for a ride. Jed found himself glancing at it every few minutes, wondering what secrets it might contain, what thoughts his father had committed to paper during those final years before his death. Edward McAllister had always been a private man, keeping his own counsel and his own worries, and Jed had often wished he could have understood him better. Duke was waiting by the gate when Jed returned, and the horse's behavior struck him as odd once again. Instead of approaching for his usual greeting, Duke stood perfectly still, his attention focused on something beyond the barn. His ears were pricked forward, his body tense with an alertness that seemed almost supernatural. It was the same posture he had been taking every evening, the same inexplicable vigilance that had started weeks ago and showed no signs of ending. "What is it, boy?" Jed asked, following the horse's gaze toward the barn. "What do you see out there that I don't?" But Duke offered no answers, only the same patient watchfulness that had become his evening ritual. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the horse took his position and began another night of mysterious observation. And for the first time since it had started, Jed decided he was going to find out what Duke was guarding. The moon hung full and bright in the October sky, casting silver light across the ranch like a benediction. Jed had spent the evening reading his father's journal by lamplight, finding entries that spoke of worry and responsibility, of decisions that weighed heavy on a man's conscience. The writing was careful and measured, but between the lines he could sense his father's growing concern about something he never quite named directly. Duke had taken his position again, standing motionless beside the fence, his dark silhouette etched against the moonlit landscape. But tonight, something felt different. The horse's usual patient vigil seemed charged with an urgency that Jed had never witnessed before. Duke's breathing was quick and shallow, his muscles coiled as if he were preparing for action rather than simply watching. Jed set the journal aside and pulled on his boots, the leather creaking in the quiet house. He had lived with questions long enough. If Duke was guarding something, protecting some secret that only a horse could understand, then it was time for both of them to face whatever truth lay hidden in that barn. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and Jed's footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path that led from the house to the outbuildings. Duke turned at his approach, and for a moment, man and horse regarded each other in the moonlight. Then Duke did something he had never done before. He walked toward the barn, stopping every few steps to look back, as if ensuring that Jed was following. "All right, boy," Jed whispered. "Show me what you've been watching." The barn doors had been left open for so many years that the hinges had rusted in place, creating a permanent archway that framed the darkness beyond. Jed stepped inside, and the familiar smells of old hay and weathered wood wrapped around him like memories. Moonlight streamed through gaps in the roof, creating patches of silver that illuminated the empty stalls and abandoned equipment. Duke followed him inside, moving with purpose toward the far corner where Jed's father had once stored the grain. The horse stopped beside a section of the floor that looked no different from any other weathered planks that had endured decades of use and neglect. But Duke lowered his head and pawed at the boards with his front hoof, the sound echoing in the empty space. Jed knelt beside his horse and examined the floorboards more closely. In the moonlight, he could see that several planks were slightly raised, as if they had been disturbed and then hastily replaced. The nails were newer than they should have been, their heads still showing traces of the black paint that had been used to camouflage their recent installation. "Well, I'll be," Jed murmured, running his fingers along the edges of the boards. "You've been trying to tell me about this, haven't you, old friend?" He went back to the house for tools, returning with a crowbar and a flashlight. Duke waited patiently as Jed worked to pry up the boards, revealing a dark cavity beneath. The beam of his flashlight illuminated a metal box, roughly the size of a briefcase, its surface pitted with rust but still intact. It had been wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, protected against moisture and time by someone who understood the importance of preservation. Jed's hands trembled as he lifted the box from its hiding place. It was heavier than he had expected, and he could hear objects shifting inside as he carried it into the moonlight. Duke followed closely, his earlier agitation replaced by what seemed like satisfaction, as if a long-held duty had finally been fulfilled. Back in the house, Jed placed the box on his kitchen table and studied it under the bright light of the overhead bulb. The lock was old, but solid, designed to protect whatever lay inside from casual discovery. He tried several keys from his father's collection before finding one that fit, and the mechanism turned with a click that seemed to echo through the years. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth and tissue paper, lay a collection of documents that took Jed's breath away. There were certificates, official-looking papers with elaborate seals and signatures, their edges brown with age, but their text still clearly readable. At the top of each document were the words United States Treasury and Gold Certificate, and the denominations made his eyes widen, 1050, some as high as .10, 0. Beneath the certificates lay a letter written in his father's careful handwriting, dated just 3 months before Edward McAllister's death. Jed's vision blurred as he read the opening lines. "My dear son, if you are reading this, then Duke has finally led you to the truth I could never find the courage to share while I lived." The letter explained what the certificates were: government bonds backed by gold reserves, issued during the economic uncertainties of the late 1800s and early 1900s. They had been payment for a land deal his father had brokered, a transaction that should have brought prosperity to Cedar Falls, but had instead been buried in legal complications and family betrayals. Edward McAllister had hidden them away, waiting for the right time to reveal their existence, but that time had never come. "The certificates are real," the letter continued, "and if my calculations are correct, they should be worth a considerable sum in today's markets. But Jed, there's more to this than money. These papers represent a trust that was broken, promises that were betrayed, and people who were cheated out of their rightful inheritance. I couldn't fix what was done, but perhaps you can." Jed read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. His father had been carrying this burden for decades, the weight of a secret that involved not just their family, but the entire community of Cedar Falls. The certificates weren't just valuable, they were evidence of something larger, something that had shaped the destiny of everyone who had ever called this place home. Duke had wandered into the kitchen and now stood beside Jed's chair, his warm breath stirring the pages of the letter. The horse's dark eyes seemed to hold a wisdom that transcended species, an understanding of duty and loyalty that had kept him watching over the barn, even when no one else knew why. "You knew, didn't you?" Jed said, stroking Duke's neck. "All this time you've been keeping watch, just like he trained you to do." The implications of the discovery began to sink in as Jed examined each certificate more carefully. If his father's calculations were accurate, the total value could be staggering enough to change not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in Cedar Falls. Enough to restore buildings, attract new businesses, bring young families back to a town that had been slowly dying for 30 years. But as he read deeper into his father's letter, Jed realized that revealing the certificates wouldn't be as simple as he had first imagined. There were people who had profited from the original betrayal, families whose current wealth was built on the foundation of what had been stolen from Cedar Falls. Bringing the truth to light would mean challenging powerful interests, confronting those who had spent decades believing their success was legitimately earned. "I'm sorry to leave this burden with you," his father's letter concluded, "but I believe that if anyone can see justice done, it's you. Duke will help you. He's been trained to guard these secrets, and he'll guard you as well. Trust him, son. Trust yourself. And remember that sometimes the hardest thing about doing what's right is finding the courage to begin." Jed folded the letter carefully and returned it to the box with the certificates. Outside, the moon was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and the first hints of dawn were touching the eastern sky. He had entered the barn with questions, and now he sat surrounded by answers that raised 100 new questions. Duke remained beside him, patient and steady, a living link to the man who had planned for this moment years before it arrived. Jed reached out and placed his hand on the horse's neck, feeling the strong pulse of life beneath the warm coat. "Well, boy," he said softly, "I guess we've got some work to do." The secret was finally out, But Jed was beginning to understand that discovery was only the first step in a journey that would test everything he thought he knew about his family, his community, and himself. The certificates in the box represented more than money. They represented a chance to right old wrongs and honor the trust his father had placed in him. But they also represented danger, because secrets this valuable were never buried without good reason, and the forces that had hidden the truth for so long wouldn't give it up without a fight. Dawn arrived with the persistent call of a meadowlark, but Jed had been awake for hours. The gold certificates spread across his kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to understand. By the pale light of morning, they seemed even more remarkable, crisp, despite their age, bearing the official seals and signatures of a government that had backed them with the full faith and credit of the United States Treasury. Each certificate was a work of art in itself, printed with intricate designs meant to prevent counterfeiting, bordered with flourishes that spoke of an era when such documents were crafted with pride and permanence. The largest denomination, a 10-0 certificate dated 1906, bore the portrait of a stern-faced man Jed didn't recognize, but whose eyes seemed to hold the weight of the nation's economic promises. Jed picked up the certificate carefully, noting the serial numbers and official markings that would need to be verified. His father's letter had mentioned calculations, but those had been made years ago, before the internet made research easier, and before gold prices had reached levels that would have seemed impossible in Edward McAllister's time. The old desktop computer in his father's study took several minutes to wheeze to life, its dial-up connection crawling through cyberspace like Duke walking through deep mud. But eventually, Jed found himself on a website dedicated to collectible currency, where gold certificates like his were listed among the most sought-after items in the numismatic world. The numbers made him sit back in his chair with a sharp intake of breath. Conservative estimates placed individual certificates at 5 to 10 times their face value, while pristine examples could command much more from serious collectors. If the entire collection was authentic and everything about them suggested they were, the total value could easily exceed $1 million, possibly much more. But as Jed delved deeper into his research, he discovered that the true worth of the certificates went beyond their collector value. Many had been issued during a period when the government was actively purchasing large quantities of gold to back the currency, and some represented claims on bullion that might still be redeemable under certain circumstances. The implications staggered him. This wasn't just a windfall, it was a fortune that could transform Cedar Falls from a dying town into a thriving community once again. Schools could be rebuilt, businesses could be attracted, young families might return to a place where their children could grow up with the same sense of belonging that Jed remembered from his own youth. He was so absorbed in his research that he almost missed the sound of a vehicle approaching the house. Duke's sharp whinny from outside alerted him, and Jed quickly gathered the certificates and returned them to their box before going to the window. A black sedan with government plates was pulling into his driveway, and Jed's first thought was that somehow word of his discovery had already spread. But the man who emerged from the car was someone Jed recognized, Dr. Benjamin Harrison, who had been the town's physician for more than 40 years and one of his father's closest friends. Doc Harrison was approaching 80 himself, his once tall frame now bent with age, but his mind remained sharp and his commitment to the community unwavering. "Morning, Jed," Doc Harrison called as he approached the porch, his medical bag in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. "Thought I'd stop by and check on you. Martha mentioned you seemed a bit preoccupied yesterday." Jed invited him in, grateful for the company and the chance to share his burden with someone he trusted. Doc Harrison had delivered him into this world, had patched up his childhood scrapes and injuries, and had been present at his father's deathbed when Edward McAllister had whispered his final words. "Actually, Doc, your timing couldn't be better," Jed said, leading him into the kitchen. "I need to talk to someone about something I found, and you knew my father better than anyone." Doc Harrison's weathered face grew serious as Jed explained about Duke's behavior and the discovery in the barn. When Jed brought out the box and showed him the certificates, the old physician's eyes widened with recognition rather than surprise. "Edward told me about these," Doc Harrison said quietly, picking up one of the certificates with the reverence due a historical artifact. "Not the details, mind you, but he said there were things hidden away that might someday help the town. I always wondered what he meant." "You knew about this?" "Not specifically, but your father was carrying a heavy burden in his final years, Jed. He'd talk about debts that needed to be paid, wrongs that needed to be righted. I thought he was just feeling guilty about the ranch's financial troubles, but this," he gestured at the certificates, "this explains a lot." Doc Harrison's presence brought a sense of stability to the situation, a reminder that Jed wasn't facing this alone. The old physician examined each certificate with the careful attention he usually reserved for diagnosing illness, noting details that Jed had missed in his excitement. "These are remarkably well preserved," Doc Harrison observed. "Your father took excellent care of them, and if I'm reading the dates correctly, they span several years of issuance. This wasn't a single transaction, this was accumulated over time." "The letter mentions a land deal," Jed said, showing Doc Harrison his father's explanation. "Something that went wrong, people who were cheated." Doc Harrison read the letter slowly, his expression growing more troubled with each paragraph. When he finished, he set it down carefully and looked at Jed with eyes that held decades of accumulated wisdom. "I remember some of this," he said finally. "It was before you were born, back in the 50s and 60s when Cedar Falls was still growing. There were plans for development, outside investors coming in with big promises. Your father was involved somehow, trying to protect the town's interests. What happened? Things fell apart, the investors disappeared, the development never materialized, and a lot of people lost money they couldn't afford to lose. That's when the exodus really began, when families realized their dreams of prosperity weren't going to come true." Doc Harrison's account filled in some of the gaps in Jed's understanding, but it also raised new questions. If his father had been involved in protecting the town's interests, how had he ended up with the certificates? And why had he hidden them instead of using them to help the people who had been hurt? "There's more to this story," Doc Harrison said, as if reading Jed's thoughts. "Your father was an honorable man, but he was also human. Whatever decisions he made them for reasons that seemed right at the time." They spent the morning going through the certificates one by one, with Doc Harrison sharing what he remembered about the period when they were issued and the circumstances that might have led to their concealment. It became clear that the certificates represented not just wealth, but a complex web of relationships and obligations that had shaped Cedar Falls for generations. As they worked, Duke maintained his position outside, no longer focused on the barn but standing guard near the house, as if he understood that the secret was now shared and needed protection in a different way. The horse's behavior had shifted subtly but noticeably since the discovery, as if a long-held duty had evolved into a new responsibility. "You realize this changes everything," Doc Harrison said as they finished their examination. "These certificates could revitalize the entire region, bring back the prosperity that we lost decades ago. But there'll be people who don't want that to happen," Jed replied, thinking of the warnings in his father's letter. "People who benefited from whatever went wrong all those years ago." Doc Harrison nodded gravely. "Your father was right to be careful. Secrets this big don't stay hidden without powerful reasons, and bringing them to light won't be without risks." As Doc Harrison prepared to leave, he placed a hand on Jed's shoulder with the gentle firmness of someone who had delivered difficult news to families for most of his adult life. "Whatever you decide to do with this discovery, you won't be doing it alone," he said. "Your father had friends, Jed. People who remember what this town used to be and who'd like to see it become that again. When you're ready to take the next step, let me know." After Doc Harrison left, Jed sat alone at his kitchen table, surrounded by documents that represented both opportunity and danger. The certificates seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, their golden seals catching the light like promises waiting to be fulfilled. Outside, Duke had resumed his watchful stance, but now Jed understood that the horse wasn't just guarding against intruders, he was protecting a legacy that could change the lives of everyone who called Cedar Falls home. The question was whether Jed had the courage to honor that legacy, regardless of the consequences. The Cedar Falls Town Hall occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, its cornerstone bearing the date 1923 and the optimistic inscription, "Built for Progress." Jed had walked past it countless times over the years, but he had never had reason to examine the historical records housed in its basement archives. Now, armed with questions about his father's past and the mysterious certificates, he found himself descending creaking wooden stairs into a repository of the town's forgotten memories. The archives were maintained by Eleanor Watts, a retired schoolteacher whose passion for local history had made her the unofficial keeper of Cedar Falls' past. She was a small woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, and she greeted Jed's request to research property records and business dealings from the 1950s and 1960s with the enthusiasm of someone who rarely had visitors interested in her carefully organized files. "Edward McAllister," she mused, pulling out a thick folder marked with his father's name. "Now there's a man who understood the importance of documentation. Always made sure his papers were properly filed, always paid his fees on time." The folder contained decades of documents, property deeds, tax records, business licenses, and correspondence with various government agencies. But as Jed worked through the papers, guided by Eleanor's encyclopedic knowledge of the filing system, a more complex picture of his father's activities began to emerge. Edward McAllister hadn't just been a rancher. He had served on the town council, participated in planning committees, and been involved in negotiations with outside developers who had promised to bring prosperity to Cedar Falls. The records showed a man deeply committed to his community's future, someone who had volunteered countless hours to ensure that any development would benefit the people who had built their lives in this remote corner of the world. "Your father was instrumental in the Crowley Development Project," Eleanor explained, pulling out another folder thick with legal documents. "That was going to be the making of this town, a planned community with new businesses, improved infrastructure, maybe even a small college." The name Crowley made Jed look up sharply. He had seen it mentioned in his father's letter, but only in passing. Now, as Eleanor spread out the development plans and correspondence, he began to understand the scope of what had been promised and what had ultimately failed. Marcus Crowley Sr. had arrived in Cedar Falls in 1958 with credentials from successful projects in other states and a vision for transforming the struggling town into a model community. The plans were impressive residential developments, commercial districts, recreational facilities that would attract families from hundreds of miles away. The town council, led by Jed's father, had been cautiously optimistic. "It all looked so promising," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the sadness of someone who had watched dreams crumble. The initial surveys were completed, the financing seemed solid, and everyone was talking about the jobs that would be created. Your father was particularly excited about the educational opportunities. But as Jed read through the correspondence, he noticed a shift in tone that occurred sometime in 1962. His father's letters became more cautious, raising questions about timeline delays and requesting additional documentation about funding sources. The responses from Crowley's organization became increasingly vague, offering reassurances without specifics. "What happened?" Jed asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Eleanor's expression darkened. "The whole thing collapsed. Turned out the financing was built on promises that couldn't be kept, and the land purchases were tied up in legal complications that Crowley hadn't disclosed. By 1964, he had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but debts and broken commitments. The impact on Cedar Falls had been devastating. Families who had invested their savings in the project lost everything. Young people who had stayed in town specifically to be part of the development left for opportunities elsewhere. The economic foundation that the community had been building for decades crumbled in a matter of months. But here's the strange part, Eleanor continued, lowering her voice as if sharing a confidence. Your father seemed to know it was coming. He started asking difficult questions months before the collapse, almost like he had inside information about Crowley's real intentions. She pulled out a folder that Jed hadn't seen before, one that contained correspondence between his father and various state and federal agencies. The letters showed Edward McAllister working tirelessly to protect the town's interests, requesting investigations into Crowley's background and attempting to halt the project before more damage could be done. He tried to warn people, Eleanor said, but by then, too many folks had already committed their money and their hopes. They didn't want to hear that their dreams might be built on lies. As Jed absorbed this information, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. His father hadn't just been involved in the Crowley development project, he had been fighting against it, trying to expose the fraud before it could destroy the community he loved. The gold certificates, hidden away in the barn, might represent compensation or evidence related to that fight. The discovery of these historical records cast his father's actions in an entirely new light. Edward McAllister hadn't been complicit in whatever had gone wrong. He had been trying to prevent it. The burden he had carried, the secrets he had kept, were all part of an effort to protect his neighbors and preserve what he could of their collective future. Eleanor walked Jed to another section of the archives, where bound volumes contained newspaper clippings from the Cedar Falls Gazette during the crucial years of the development project. The headlines told a story of rising hopes and crushing disappointment, but they also revealed details about the key players that hadn't been included in the official records. Marcus Crowley Sr. had not worked alone. He had been backed by investors from out of state, men with connections to mining interests and railroad companies who saw potential profits in the undeveloped lands around Cedar Falls. When the project collapsed, these investors had quietly withdrawn, leaving Crowley to face the legal consequences alone. But the most shocking revelation came in a newspaper clipping from 1965, more than a year after the project's collapse. It reported that Marcus Crowley Sr. had been found dead in his hotel room in Denver, apparently from a heart attack. Though the article mentioned irregularities that had prompted a brief police investigation, no one ever found out what happened to the money, Eleanor said quietly. The investors claimed they had lost everything, but there were rumors that significant assets had been hidden away before the collapse. Your father always believed there was more to the story. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Jed thanked Eleanor for her help and gathered copies of the most relevant documents. The historical records had provided crucial context for his father's letter and the hidden certificates, but they had also raised disturbing new questions about the forces that had destroyed Cedar Falls's prosperity. Walking back to his truck, Jed noticed a black sedan parked across the street from the town hall, its windows tinted dark enough to obscure the occupants. He had seen the same vehicle earlier, outside the general store, when he had stopped to tell Martha about his research, and its presence felt less like coincidence than surveillance. Duke was waiting in the truck bed, his ears alert, and his attention focused on the sedan. When Jed started the engine, the horse's tension was palpable, a reminder that some secrets carried their own inherent dangers. As they drove home, Jed noticed the sedan following at a distance, maintaining just enough separation to avoid obvious detection. The realization that he was being watched sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the October weather. Someone was already aware of his activities, already tracking his movements with the efficiency of people who had experience in such matters. The gold certificates weren't just valuable, they were evidence of something that powerful interests wanted to keep buried. Back at the ranch, Jed carefully locked the certificates in his father's old safe before going outside to check on Duke. The horse was standing near the barn, not in his usual watching position, but alert to potential threats from beyond the property lines. The message was clear, the secret was out, and they were no longer alone in knowing it. As darkness fell over the ranch, Jed found himself wondering if his father had felt this same sense of being watched. This awareness that some truths were too dangerous to reveal without careful preparation. The historical records had shown him the scope of what his father had been fighting against, but they had also made it clear that the fight was far from over. The certificates in the safe represented more than money. They were evidence of a conspiracy that had stolen the future from an entire community. But bringing that evidence to light would mean confronting people who had spent decades believing their version of history was the only one that mattered. And as the black sedan's appearance had demonstrated, those people were already taking steps to protect their interests. 3 days after his visit to the town archives, Jed was mending fence posts on the north pasture when he heard the sound of an expensive engine approaching the ranch. Duke's head shot up immediately, his ears pinned back in a way that signaled danger rather than simple alertness. The horse had been increasingly restless since the discovery, as if he could sense threats that human perception couldn't detect. The vehicle that rounded the bend in the access road was a sleek silver Mercedes, its chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun, and its presence as out of place on the dusty ranch road as a peacock in a chicken coop. It moved with the deliberate confidence of someone who was accustomed to going wherever they pleased, regardless of whether they were welcome. Jed set down his tools and walked toward the house, Duke falling into step beside him with the protective instinct of a loyal guardian. The Mercedes pulled to a stop near the front porch, and its driver emerged with the smooth efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual many times before. Marcus Crowley Jr. was a man in his early 60s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people in Cedar Falls earned in a month. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to mirror brightness, and his smile carried the practiced warmth of someone who made his living, convincing people to trust him. But his eyes held a coldness that reminded Jed uncomfortably of a snake evaluating potential prey. "Mr. McAllister," Crowley said, extending a manicured hand. "Marcus Crowley. I believe our fathers knew each other many years ago." Jed accepted the handshake briefly, noting the soft texture of skin that had never known honest work. "Mr. Crowley, what brings you out this way?" "I happen to be in the area on business, and I thought it might be nice to meet the son of Edward McAllister. Your father was quite a remarkable man, very involved in community affairs, as I recall." The comment carried undertones that made Jed's instincts sharpen. Crowley's tone was pleasant enough, but there was something calculated about his presence here, something that suggested this visit was anything but casual. "He was," Jed replied carefully. "What kind of business brings you to Cedar Falls?" Crowley's smile widened, but the warmth never reached his eyes. "Development opportunities, primarily. I've been studying the region's potential for some time now, and I have to say, this area has tremendous possibilities for the right kind of investment." As they talked, Jed noticed details that reinforced his growing unease. Crowley's Mercedes had government license plates, though he carried himself like a private businessman. His suit jacket was cut to accommodate something bulky underneath his left arm, and his casual survey of the ranch buildings had the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting reconnaissance. "In fact," Crowley continued, "I've been particularly interested in this property. The location is ideal for certain types of development, and I understand you might be facing some financial pressures that could make a sale attractive." The offer was presented as a casual observation, but Jed recognized it as the real reason for the visit. Crowley wasn't here to reminisce about their father's relationship. He was here to acquire the ranch, and his timing suggested he knew about the recent discovery in the barn. "The ranch isn't for sale," Jed said firmly. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and I intend to keep it that way." Crowley's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle hardening that suggested he wasn't accustomed to hearing the word no. "I understand the sentimental attachment, Mr. McAllister, but sentiment doesn't pay bills or maintain property. I'm prepared to make a very generous offer, substantially above market value." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Crowley alternating between veiled threats about the ranch's financial viability and increasingly specific offers that demonstrated detailed knowledge of Jed's circumstances. It became clear that this wasn't an impromptu visit. Crowley had been researching the property and its owner with the thoroughness of someone who made acquisition his profession. As Crowley prepared to leave, he reached into his jacket and produced a business card that felt as expensive as it looked. "Think about my offer, Mr. McAllister. The development I have in mind would benefit the entire region, bring jobs and prosperity back to Cedar Falls. Sometimes, holding on to the past prevents us from embracing a better future." After the Mercedes disappeared down the road, Jed stood on his porch, feeling as if he had just been visited by a predator sizing up its territory. Duke remained agitated, pacing near the fence and occasionally snorting his displeasure. The horse's reaction confirmed what Jed's instincts had been telling him. Marcus Crowley Jr. was dangerous in ways that his polished exterior was designed to conceal. That evening, Jed drove into town to speak with Sheriff Cole Brennan, a man who had worn the badge in Cedar Falls for more than 20 years and who understood the community's dynamics better than anyone. Cole was approaching retirement age, his weathered face bearing the lines of someone who had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little. "Marcus Crowley Jr.," Cole repeated when Jed described his visitor. "Yeah, I know about him. Been hearing his name mentioned in various contexts for the past few months. Nothing I could pin down, but enough to make me pay attention." They were sitting in Cole's office, a cramped space above the volunteer fire department that served as the town's law enforcement headquarters. The walls were covered with photographs spanning decades of community events, reminders of when Cedar Falls had been large enough to warrant celebrations. "What kind of contexts?" Jed asked. Cole leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Land acquisitions, mainly. He's been buying up properties throughout the region, always through intermediaries, always for substantially more than the asking price. Folks don't ask too many questions when someone's offering them enough money to start over somewhere else." The pattern was disturbing, but not necessarily illegal. However, Cole's next revelation cast Crowley's activities in a more sinister light. "The thing is, most of the properties he's acquired have been abandoned or foreclosed within 6 months of the sale. Families take his money and leave town, but then they discover that their new lives don't work out the way they planned. By the time they want to come back, their property is tied up in legal complications that make reclamation nearly impossible." Jed thought about his encounter with Crowley, remembering the man's confidence and the implied threats beneath his polished courtesy. "Sounds like he's deliberately driving people away." "That's what I think, but proving it is another matter entirely. The man covers his tracks well, and he's got connections that reach pretty high up the political ladder. Complaints about his business practices tend to disappear into bureaucratic limbo." Cole opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder that contained newspaper clippings and official reports spanning several years. The documents painted a picture of Marcus Crowley Jr. as a successful developer with projects throughout the Mountain States, but they also revealed a pattern of controversy and legal challenges that had never quite resulted in criminal charges. "His father was involved in some kind of scandal here back in the 60s, Cole said. "Before my time, but the old-timers remember it as the thing that really started Cedar Falls' decline. Seems like the son is following in Daddy's footsteps, just with better lawyers and more sophisticated methods." As Jed examined the documents, one particular newspaper clipping caught his attention. It showed Marcus Crowley Jr. at a groundbreaking ceremony for a development project in Montana, and standing beside him was a man whose face looked familiar despite the poor quality of the photograph. "That's interesting," Cole said, noticing Jed's focus on the image. "Recognize someone? Maybe. The man next to Crowley, there's something familiar about him, but I can't place where I might have seen him." Cole studied the photograph more closely, then reached for another folder. Could be one of his business associates. The man seems to travel with a small entourage of advisors and security personnel. Not unusual for someone in his position, but it does suggest he's got enemies somewhere. The conversation with Sheriff Cole provided context for Crowley's visit and confirmed Jed's suspicions about the man's true intentions. But it also raised troubling questions about how much Crowley knew about the discovery in the barn and what lengths he might go to in order to acquire the ranch. As Jed drove home under a sky brilliant with stars, he found himself thinking about his father's letter and the warnings it contained about powerful people who had profited from old betrayals. Marcus Crowley Jr. represented exactly the kind of threat Edward McAllister had anticipated, and his appearance at the ranch suggested that the hidden certificates were more than just valuable. They were evidence that someone was determined to suppress. Duke was waiting by the gate when Jed returned, his alert posture indicating that the ranch had remained under surveillance during his absence. The horse's vigilance was no longer just protective, it was tactical, the behavior of an animal that understood his role in defending something precious against those who would steal it. Back in the house, Jed opened his father's safe and looked again at the gold certificates, trying to understand what made them dangerous enough to attract the attention of someone like Marcus Crowley Jr. The documents themselves were valuable, but their true worth seemed to lie in what they represented, proof of crimes that powerful people had spent decades trying to forget. As he prepared for bed, Jed found himself checking the locks on his doors and windows with new attention to detail. The game had changed with Crowley's visit, escalating from a family mystery to something that threatened his safety and his ability to remain on the land his family had worked for 3 generations. But he also felt a growing determination to see justice done, to honor his father's sacrifice and expose the truth that had been buried for so long. The certificates weren't just his inheritance, they were his responsibility, and he intended to fulfill that obligation, regardless of the personal cost. The discovery of the hidden map came 3 days after Marcus Crowley's visit, while Jed was examining his father's journal more carefully in the lamplight of the early morning hours. He had been reading the entries chronologically, trying to understand the progression of his father's thoughts and concerns during the turbulent years of the development project's collapse. Most of the journal consisted of routine observations about ranch work, weather patterns, and community events, but scattered throughout were cryptic references that had taken on new meaning since the discovery of the certificates. Entries like "checked the insurance policy today" and "Duke responded well to the new training" now seemed to carry double meanings that spoke of preparations for circumstances his father hoped would never arise. It was while examining a section dated 1987, the year of the journal's final entries, that Jed noticed an irregularity in the binding. The leather along the spine had been carefully opened and restitched, creating a hidden compartment that was virtually invisible unless examined with specific intent. Inside, sewn into the lining with the same precision his father had applied to all his work, was a piece of oilcloth containing a hand-drawn map. The map showed the ranch property with remarkable detail, including topographical features and landmarks that would be meaningful only to someone who had lived on the land for decades. But what made it extraordinary were the symbols marked at various locations throughout the property, small X's, accompanied by numbers and letters that clearly indicated additional hiding places. Duke, who had taken to sleeping on the porch since Crowley's visit, seemed to sense the significance of the discovery. The horse appeared at the kitchen window, as if summoned, his dark eyes fixed on the map spread across the table. When Jed looked up, Duke moved toward the front door with the purposeful stride of someone who had work to do. The first location marked on the map was near the old well behind the house, a structure that had been abandoned when the main water line was installed in the 1970s. The symbol indicated something buried 3 feet southeast of the wellhead, and Duke led Jed directly to the spot without hesitation. Digging in the pre-dawn darkness felt like participating in an archaeological expedition that spanned his own family's history. 2 feet down, Jed's shovel struck something solid, a metal cylinder wrapped in the same type of oilcloth that had protected the certificates. Inside were more documents, including what appeared to be contracts, correspondence, and photographs that dated back to the original Crowley development project. The photographs were particularly revealing. They showed Marcus Crowley Sr. meeting with men in expensive suits, their faces serious, and their body language suggesting high-stakes negotiations. But more importantly, they showed Edward McAllister in the background of several meetings, his presence suggesting he had been monitoring the situation more closely than the official records indicated. One photograph caught Jed's attention immediately. It showed his father standing beside a man whose face was partially obscured by shadow, but whose expensive clothing and confident posture marked him as someone of significant importance. On the back of the photograph, in his father's careful handwriting, were the words "Denver Meeting, August 1963, the real decision-makers." The documents accompanying the photographs told a story that complemented and expanded what Jed had learned from the town archives. They revealed that the Crowley development project had been funded by a consortium of investors with connections to mining interests and federal land management agencies. The true purpose hadn't been community development, it had been resource extraction disguised as civic improvement. Edward McAllister's correspondence with various government agencies showed him raising increasingly urgent questions about environmental impact studies and mineral rights assessments that had been fast-tracked without proper oversight. His letters demonstrated a growing awareness that Cedar Falls was being targeted not for development, but for exploitation. As the sun rose over the mountains, Jed and Duke moved to the second location marked on the map, a grove of cottonwood trees near the creek that bordered the eastern edge of the property. Here they found another cache, this one containing geological surveys and mineral assessment reports that had apparently been conducted without the knowledge or consent of local property owners. The surveys revealed significant deposits of rare earth minerals beneath much of the land around Cedar Falls, resources that would have been extraordinarily valuable to the right industrial interests. The reports were dated 1962, a full year before the development project was announced to the public, suggesting that Crowley's investors had known about the mineral wealth long before they approached the community with their promises of prosperity. But the most shocking discovery came in the third cache, located near the old fence line that separated the McAllister Ranch from what had once been the Patterson homestead. Here, wrapped in multiple layers of protective material, were legal documents that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had destroyed Cedar Falls. The papers included the original partnership agreement between Marcus Crowley Sr. and his investors, contracts that explicitly outlined plans for mineral extraction and resource development that bore no resemblance to the community improvement project that had been presented to the town council. More damning still were financial records showing payments to local officials and agreements with federal agencies that had been negotiated without public knowledge or oversight. Among these documents was a letter that made Jed's hands tremble as he read it. Written by Marcus Crowley Sr. to his primary investor, it detailed plans to acquire the mineral rights through a combination of legal manipulation and strategic bankruptcies that would force property owners to sell at below-market prices. The key, Crowley Sr. had written, is to ensure that the local population loses confidence in their economic future. Once they believe their situation is hopeless, they will accept any offer that allows them to start over elsewhere. The McAllister property is particularly important. Its location gives access to the richest deposits, and its acquisition will signal to other holdouts that resistance is futile. The letter was dated 6 months before the development project's public collapse, proving that the failure had been planned from the beginning. The investors had never intended to build a thriving community. They had intended to create conditions that would force current residents to abandon their land so it could be acquired cheaply for resource extraction. But Edward McAllister had discovered their plan, and the evidence hidden around his property proved that he had been gathering documentation of the conspiracy for years. The gold certificates weren't just valuable, they were payment for mineral rights that had been stolen through fraud, and their existence proved that the original theft could still be challenged legally. As Jed absorbed the implications of these discoveries, Duke's behavior made perfect sense. The horse hadn't just been trained to guard the barn, he had been trained to protect multiple locations where evidence of the conspiracy was hidden. His nightly vigil had been part of a larger pattern of surveillance designed to ensure that the truth would eventually be revealed. The discovery of the map and its associated caches transformed Jed's understanding of his father's final years. Edward McAllister hadn't been a broken man, carrying guilt about failed business ventures. He had been a determined investigator, gathering evidence to expose one of the largest resource theft conspiracies in the region's history. But the evidence also made clear why Marcus Crowley Jr. was so determined to acquire the ranch. The documents hidden on the property didn't just prove historical crimes, they provided the legal foundation for challenging current ownership of mineral rights worth millions of dollars. The stakes were far higher than Jed had initially understood, and the danger was correspondingly greater. That evening, as Jed carefully catalogued and secured the newly discovered documents, he received a phone call that confirmed his growing suspicions about being watched. The voice was electronically disguised, but the message was clear enough. "Mr. McAllister, you've been asking a lot of questions lately, questions that some people find disturbing. It would be wise to consider Mr. Crowley's generous offer before circumstances make such generosity impossible to maintain." The call lasted less than 30 seconds, but its implications echoed long after the line went dead. The conspiracy his father had uncovered was still active, still protected by people who had the resources and connections to eliminate threats to their interests. The evidence hidden around the ranch represented not just historical justice, it represented immediate danger to anyone who threatened to expose it. As Jed locked the documents in his father's safe alongside the gold certificates, he realized that he had reached a point where retreat was no longer possible. The truth was too important to suppress, and his father's sacrifice demanded that the story be told regardless of personal consequences. But he also understood that moving forward would require allies, people who shared his commitment to justice and who possessed the skills necessary to challenge powerful interests. The evidence was compelling, but evidence alone wouldn't be enough to overcome decades of successful concealment. Duke took his position on the porch as darkness fell, no longer just a guardian but a partner in a mission that had been passed down from one generation to the next. The horse's vigilance was a reminder that some responsibilities transcended individual lifetimes, and that the fight for truth and justice was worth whatever price it might demand. The letter from his mother was hidden in the last place. Jed would have thought to look taped to the underside of the kitchen table, where she had prepared thousands of meals during her too brief life. He found it only because Duke had begun acting strangely again, not with the purposeful vigilance that had led to the other discoveries, but with a restless energy that seemed to pull him toward the house rather than away from it. Jed was cleaning the kitchen after a simple dinner when Duke appeared at the window, pawing at the glass in a way that was completely unlike his usual behavior. When Jed opened the door, the horse pushed past him and walked directly to the kitchen table, lowering his head and sniffing at something underneath. Following Duke's lead, Jed got down on his hands and knees and felt along the underside of the table. His fingers found the edge of an envelope that had been carefully secured with waterproof tape, hidden in a location where only someone who knew exactly where to look would ever discover it. The envelope was addressed simply, "For my son," in handwriting he hadn't seen in more than 50 years, but recognized immediately. His mother, Catherine McAllister, had died when Jed was 19, a victim of the cancer that had taken so many of her generation before medical science could offer real hope. He had few clear memories of her, but they were all warm, gentle hands, a voice that could soothe any trouble, and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's heart. Inside the envelope were several sheets of paper covered with her careful script, dated just weeks before her death. The letter began with words that brought tears to his eyes. "My dearest Jed, if you are reading this, then Duke has finally decided it's time for you to know the whole truth about what your father and I have been trying to protect." The revelation that his mother had known about the conspiracy, had been an active participant in gathering evidence against it, changed everything Jed thought he understood about his parents and their relationship. Catherine McAllister hadn't been just a rancher's wife who had tragically died young. She had been a partner in an investigation that had consumed the final years of her life. "Your father believes he's been protecting me by handling this alone," the letter continued. "But the truth is that I've been the one with the connections to get the information we needed. My brother Thomas works for the Bureau of Land Management in Denver, and through him, I've learned things that would terrify you if you knew how deep this corruption goes." Jed had to pause in his reading. His uncle Thomas had visited occasionally during his childhood, a quiet man who worked for the government and never talked much about his job. Jed had assumed he was just another federal bureaucrat, but apparently Thomas Morrison had been strategically placed to monitor and document the illegal activities that were destroying communities throughout the Mountain West. The letter revealed that the conspiracy involving Marcus Crowley Sr. extended far beyond Cedar Falls. It was part of a systematic effort to acquire mineral-rich lands throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, through a combination of legal manipulation, economic pressure, and outright fraud. The investors behind the scheme included mining companies, defense contractors, and government officials who profited from selling access to strategic resources at below-market prices. "We have evidence of similar projects in 17 different towns," Catherine's letter explained. "Each one follows the same pattern promises of development that are designed to fail, economic pressure that forces residents to sell their land cheaply, and mineral extraction that begins as soon as the original owners are gone. The profits are enormous, but they're built on the destruction of entire communities." But the most shocking revelation came in the letter's middle pages, where Catherine described her discovery that Marcus Crowley Sr. had not died of natural causes, as reported in the newspapers. Her brother Thomas had access to the federal investigation files, and they told a very different story about Crowley's death and the circumstances surrounding it. "Thomas showed me the real autopsy report," she wrote. "Marcus Crowley Sr. was murdered, poisoned by someone who wanted to silence him before he could expose the full extent of the conspiracy. But here's what his killers didn't know. He had already made arrangements to ensure that the evidence would survive his death." The letter explained that Crowley Sr. had begun to develop a conscience in his final months, horrified by the human cost of the schemes he had helped implement. He had contacted Edward McAllister in secret, offering to provide documentation that would expose the entire conspiracy in exchange for protection from the federal authorities. "Your father met with Crowley 3 times before the man's death," Catherine revealed. During those meetings, Crowley provided the gold certificates as proof of the payments he had received for facilitating the mineral rights transfers. He also gave us locations where additional evidence was hidden, including documents that would prove the involvement of federal officials in the illegal scheme. The certificates, Jed realized, weren't just valuable collectibles, they were smoking guns that proved a massive conspiracy to defraud landowners throughout the region. Each certificate represented a specific payment for a specific illegal transaction, and together they formed a paper trail that could destroy the careers and fortunes of dozens of powerful people. But Catherine's letter contained one more revelation that left Jed staring at the pages in disbelief. The conspiracy wasn't just historical, it was ongoing, and Marcus Crowley Jr. was continuing his father's work with the backing of the same investors who had profited from the original fraud. Thomas has been watching Crowley's son for years, the letter continued. The young man learned his father's methods, but he's more careful about covering his tracks. He's been acquiring properties throughout the region using the same techniques, and the mineral extraction is still happening. The difference is that now it's being done through legitimate-looking mining companies that have federal contracts for strategic resource development. The letter concluded with instructions that broke Jed's heart, even as they filled him with determination. If something happens to your father and me, the responsibility will fall to you. The evidence is hidden in places where only Duke can find it. We trained him specifically for this purpose. When the time is right, when you have all the pieces, take everything to Thomas Morrison in Denver. He's been waiting 40 years for enough evidence to bring down this conspiracy. Catherine had included her brother's contact information, updated as recently as the previous year, according to a note in different handwriting that was clearly Edward's. Thomas Morrison was now retired from the BLM, but still had connections in federal law enforcement, and according to the note, he had been expecting to hear from Jed eventually. As Jed finished reading his mother's letter, Duke moved closer and rested his head against Jed's shoulder in a gesture of comfort that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries between species. The horse had been carrying this secret for decades, trained from birth to protect evidence that could expose one of the largest resource theft conspiracies in American history. The revelation transformed everything Jed thought he knew about his parents' deaths. His mother's cancer might have been natural, but the timing of his father's heart attack, just months after her death, now seemed suspicious. Edward McAllister had been under enormous stress, carrying the burden of an investigation that had cost him his wife and threatened to cost him his life. But more importantly, the letter revealed that the fight his parents had begun was far from over. Marcus Crowley Jr. represented a continuation of the same criminal enterprise that had destroyed Cedar Falls, and the evidence hidden on the ranch was the key to stopping him before he could destroy other communities the same way. Jed carefully folded his mother's letter and placed it with the other documents in his father's safe. The gold certificates were no longer just valuable collectibles. They were evidence in an active criminal investigation that had been waiting 4 decades for someone with the courage to see it through to its conclusion. Outside, the October wind was picking up, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks and the promise of a winter that would test the resolve of anyone determined to stay and fight. But Jed felt a clarity he hadn't experienced since the whole mystery began. He understood now why Duke had been watching, why his father had hidden the evidence so carefully, and why his mother had entrusted him with a mission that would define the rest of his life. The conspiracy that had destroyed Cedar Falls wasn't just history, it was present, ongoing, and threatening other communities throughout the region. The evidence hidden on the ranch represented the only chance to stop it, but bringing that evidence to light would mean challenging people who had killed to protect their secrets and who wouldn't hesitate to kill again. As he prepared for bed, Jed found himself thinking not about the danger ahead, but about the trust his parents had placed in him and the obligation he had to honor their sacrifice. The certificates and documents weren't just his inheritance, they were his responsibility, and he intended to fulfill that responsibility regardless of the personal cost. Duke resumed his position on the porch, but his vigilance had taken on a new quality. He was no longer just guarding against intruders. He was preparing for a final confrontation that would determine whether justice would finally be served or whether the conspiracy would claim another generation of victims. The game had changed completely with the discovery of his mother's letter. What had started as a family mystery had become a federal case, and what had seemed like historical injustice had revealed itself as ongoing criminal activity. The stakes were higher than Jed had imagined, but so was his determination to see the truth finally brought to light. The hidden cache his father had prepared for this moment lay beneath the floor of the old root cellar, a stone-lined chamber that had been carved into the hillside behind the house more than a century ago. Jed discovered it only after following the final set of directions in his mother's letter, which had led him through a sequence of landmarks that formed a complex navigation system designed to prevent accidental discovery. Inside a waterproof container the size of a steamer trunk, Edward McAllister had assembled everything his son would need for the confrontation that was now inevitable. There were weapons, a hunting rifle, a shotgun, and a pistol, all meticulously maintained and accompanied by adequate ammunition. But more importantly, there were supplies that spoke of careful planning, preserved food, water purification tablets, medical supplies, and communication equipment that suggested his father had anticipated the possibility of being cut off from normal support systems. Most significantly, the cache contained detailed maps of the ranch and surrounding areas, marked with strategic positions and escape routes that had been planned with military precision. Edward McAllister had been more than a rancher and community leader. He had been a veteran of Korea who understood tactics and had applied that knowledge to defending his family's legacy. The maps revealed defensive positions throughout the property, locations where supplies had been pre-positioned and where a small group could hold off larger forces indefinitely. The ranch wasn't just a piece of land, it was a fortress that had been designed to protect the evidence hidden within its boundaries. But the most sobering discovery was a letter addressed "to be opened only if they come for you," which contained instructions for contacting not just Uncle Thomas in Denver, but a network of allies that Edward had cultivated over decades of investigation. The list included federal agents, investigative journalists, and other landowners who had been fighting similar battles throughout the region. As Jed studied his father's preparations, Duke's behavior took on a new urgency. The horse was no longer content to maintain his usual vigilant watch. He was actively patrolling the property boundaries, his movements systematic and purposeful. It was as if he could sense that the long period of waiting was coming to an end. The sense of impending confrontation was confirmed that afternoon when Doc Harrison arrived at the ranch, driving faster than his usual careful pace. His weathered face was grim as he climbed out of his truck, and his first words carried the weight of bad news. "They're moving, Jed," he said without preamble. "Crowley's people have been asking questions all over town, offering money for information about your activities. Martha's store, the diner, even the post office, they're trying to find out what you've discovered and who you might have talked to." Doc Harrison had brought Sheriff Cole with him, and the two men formed a council of war in Jed's kitchen as they shared what they had learned about Crowley's escalating activities. The developer wasn't just gathering information, he was assembling a team of operatives who had been conducting surveillance and preparing for what looked like a direct assault on the ranch. "I've been doing some checking of my own," Sheriff Cole said, spreading out a folder of documents on the table. "Crowley's got connections that reach all the way to Washington. Some of the companies backing him have federal contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're not going to let one old rancher threaten their profits." The sheriff's investigation had revealed that several black SUVs had been seen in the area, vehicles with government plates and occupants who carried themselves like military or intelligence operatives. Local residents had been approached by men claiming to be conducting security assessments, but their questions had focused specifically on the McAllister Ranch and its current occupant. "There's more," Doc Harrison said quietly. "I made some calls to contacts I still have in the medical community. Your father's death wasn't as natural as we thought. The symptoms he experienced in his final weeks are consistent with slow-acting poisons that were being developed for intelligence operations during the Cold War. The revelation that his father had likely been murdered transformed Jed's grief into cold determination. Edward McAllister hadn't died of a broken heart. After losing his wife, he had been eliminated by people who saw him as a threat to their criminal enterprise. The investigation he had conducted, the evidence he had gathered, had cost him his life. But his death had also been premature from his killer's perspective. The evidence was still hidden, still protected by a horse who had been trained for this specific purpose, and now it was in the hands of a son who understood both its value and its danger. As evening approached, the three men developed a plan that drew on both the resources Edward had prepared and the contacts he had cultivated. Doc Harrison would drive to Denver under cover of darkness to deliver copies of the most important documents to Uncle Thomas Morrison, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if something happened at the ranch. Sheriff Cole would coordinate with federal contacts who could provide backup when the evidence was formally presented to authorities. His role would be crucial in distinguishing between legitimate federal agents and the corrupt officials who were part of the conspiracy. Jed would remain at the ranch with Duke, using his father's preparations to defend the property and the original evidence until help could arrive. It was the most dangerous role, but it was also the most important. Without the original documents and certificates, any copies could be dismissed as forgeries. As Doc Harrison prepared to leave for Denver, he pulled Jed aside for a private conversation that carried the weight of a final farewell. "Your father was the best man I ever knew," the old physician said. "He sacrificed everything, his peace of mind, his health, ultimately his life, to protect this community and expose the truth. Don't let his sacrifice be in vain, but don't throw your life away unnecessarily either." After Doc Harrison left, Jed and Sheriff Cole spent the evening implementing the defensive measures Edward had planned. They positioned supplies at strategic locations, tested communication equipment, and familiarized themselves with the escape routes that had been mapped out in careful detail. Duke seemed to understand that the time for waiting was over. The horse took position near the barn, not in his usual watching pose, but in an alert stance that suggested he was ready for action. His training was finally going to be tested, and he appeared eager to fulfill the purpose for which he had been prepared. As midnight approached, Sheriff Cole's radio crackled with a transmission that confirmed their worst fears. Multiple vehicles were approaching Cedar Falls from different directions, moving without lights and coordinating their movements in a way that suggested military-style planning. "They're coming tonight," Cole said grimly. "Probably figure they can take what they want and clean up any loose ends before anyone realizes what's happened." Jed checked his father's weapons one final time, ensuring that each was loaded and ready. He wasn't a soldier like his father had been, but he understood the stakes and was prepared to defend what Edward and Catherine McAllister had died to protect. The evidence hidden on the ranch represented more than just proof of historical crimes. It was the key to preventing future atrocities against communities throughout the region. The gold certificates and accompanying documents could expose a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for decades, bringing justice not just for Cedar Falls, but for all the families who had been cheated out of their heritage. As he took his position at the window overlooking the access road, Jed thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had begun with Duke's mysterious vigil at the barn and had led through layers of family secrets to a confrontation that would determine whether truth or corruption would ultimately prevail. Duke moved to his side, the horse's presence a reminder that he wasn't facing this challenge alone. His parents had prepared for this night, had trained his companion for this purpose, and had entrusted him with a mission that transcended personal safety or comfort. In the distance, the first headlights appeared on the horizon, moving steadily toward the ranch, where 3 generations of McAllisters had built their lives and where the final battle for their legacy was about to begin. The long wait was over, and the time for action had finally arrived. The original deed to Cedar Falls, dated 1889 and bearing the official seal of the Colorado Territory, lay spread across Jed's kitchen table like a battle standard waiting to be raised. He had discovered it in the final cache, the one his father had marked, "Open only when they come," and its contents had taken his breath away. This wasn't just another piece of evidence, it was the foundation document that proved everything. According to the deed, the land that comprised not just Cedar Falls, but the entire surrounding valley, had been granted to a community trust established by the original settlers. The mineral rights had never been sold, never been transferred, and certainly never been acquired by the investors who had spent decades extracting wealth from beneath the town's foundations. Every mining operation, every development project, every resource extraction scheme had been built on a foundation of fraudulent claims. The headlights were closer now, 3 separate vehicles approaching along different routes, with their lights extinguished, except when necessary to navigate the rough terrain. Sheriff Cole's radio chattered with reports from his deputies, positioned at strategic locations throughout the valley, confirming what they had feared: this wasn't just Crowley and a few associates. This was a coordinated operation involving enough personnel to overwhelm any conventional resistance. "They're professionals," Cole said grimly, studying the pattern of approach through his binoculars. "Military or intelligence background, moving with tactical precision. They know exactly what they're doing." Jed folded the territorial deed carefully and placed it inside his jacket, along with the most critical certificates and documents. If the worst happened, if the ranch was overrun and the evidence was seized, he needed to ensure that the most important pieces would survive. The deed was the keystone that held everything together. Without it, the other evidence was just fragments of a larger truth. Duke had positioned himself between the house and the approaching vehicles, his body language transformed from vigilant watchfulness to active aggression. The horse was no longer just guarding, he was preparing to fight, and his training was evident in every movement. Edward McAllister had prepared his companion for this night with the same thoroughness he had applied to every other aspect of the defense. The first vehicle reached the edge of the property just after 1 in the morning, stopping at the cattle guard that marked the boundary between public road and private land. Through the night vision scope his father had included in the weapons cache, Jed could see figures emerging from the vehicles with the coordinated efficiency of a special operations team. Marcus Crowley Jr. stepped out of the lead vehicle, his expensive suit replaced by tactical gear that emphasized his role as the operations commander rather than its public face. He was accompanied by 8 men whose movements and equipment marked them as experienced operators, people who had conducted similar missions in environments where failure meant more than legal consequences. "Mr. McAllister," Crowley's voice carried clearly across the distance, amplified by a portable speaker system. "I believe we have some business to discuss. I'm prepared to make you a final offer for your property, one that takes into account the unique circumstances we're all facing." Jed responded by turning on the floodlights his father had installed around the house and outbuildings, illuminating the entire area and destroying the tactical advantage that darkness provided. The sudden brightness revealed the full scope of Crowley's operation: additional vehicles positioned to block escape routes, personnel with equipment that suggested they were prepared for a prolonged siege. "The property isn't for sale," Jed called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "And neither is the truth about what your family did to this community." Crowley's response was immediate and chilling. "I'm afraid you misunderstand the situation, Mr. McAllister. We're not here to negotiate a purchase. We're here to recover stolen property and eliminate security threats. You have in your possession documents that belong to my organization, and we're prepared to use whatever force is necessary to retrieve them." The admission was exactly what Jed had hoped, for a clear statement of criminal intent that was being recorded by the equipment Sheriff Cole had installed earlier. Whatever happened next, there would be evidence of Crowley's true purpose and the lengths he was willing to go to suppress the truth. But Crowley wasn't finished with his revelations. "Your father made the same mistake you're making now," he thought. "He could challenge forces beyond his understanding. It took us several years to arrange his elimination, but we eventually succeeded. Your mother was easier. A few adjustments to her cancer medication ensured that she wouldn't live long enough to cause problems." The casual admission that both his parents had been murdered hit Jed like a physical blow, but it also crystallized his resolve. This wasn't just about exposing historical crimes anymore. It was about bringing justice for the people who had raised him and who had died, trying to protect their community. Duke's response to Crowley's words was immediate and violent. The horse reared up with a scream of rage that seemed to echo across the valley, his hooves pawing the air as if he were attacking invisible enemies. The sound was primal and terrifying, the cry of a creature that had been trained to protect and whose protective instincts had been pushed beyond the breaking point. "Your parents trained that animal well," Crowley observed, his tone carrying a mixture of admiration and contempt. "But horses are no match for modern weapons and professional operators. Surrender the documents now, and his death will be quick." The threat against Duke was the final straw. Jed raised his father's rifle and placed the crosshairs on Crowley's center mass, his finger finding the trigger with muscle memory inherited from decades of hunting. "You're not taking anything from this ranch," he said, his voice carrying across the distance with deadly certainty, "and you're not harming my horse." Crowley's laughter was cold and confident. "You're one man with a hunting rifle, Mr. McAllister. We're 8 professionals with military-grade equipment. The outcome of this confrontation is not in doubt." But as if summoned by the mention of overwhelming odds, new lights appeared on the horizon, the headlights of vehicles approaching from the direction of town. Sheriff Cole's radio crackled with an excited transmission from one of his deputies. Federal vehicles approaching from the south, FBI logos clearly visible, ETA 2 minutes. Doc Harrison's mission to Denver had succeeded. Uncle Thomas Morrison had activated the network of federal contacts that had been waiting 40 years for enough evidence to move against the conspiracy. The cavalry was arriving just as Edward McAllister had planned, but whether they would arrive in time remained to be seen. Crowley's confidence evaporated as he realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. "Move now," he barked into his radio. "Secure the documents and eliminate all witnesses. We have less than 2 minutes before this becomes a federal incident." The tactical team began advancing toward the house with the coordinated precision of professionals who had conducted similar operations in hostile territory. But they had underestimated both the defensive preparations Edward McAllister had made and the determination of a man who was fighting to honor his parents' sacrifice. Jed's first shot took out the floodlight on the lead vehicle, plunging half the assault team back into darkness and disrupting their night vision equipment. His second shot shattered the windshield of Crowley's command vehicle, sending glass fragments spraying across the tactical team and forcing them to take cover. Duke charged directly at the advancing operatives, his hooves striking sparks from the gravel as he moved with the speed and power of a natural predator. The horse had been trained for this moment, and his attack was both coordinated and devastating. 2 men went down under his hooves before the others could react, their tactical formations shattered by an opponent they had never anticipated. Sheriff Cole emerged from his concealed position near the barn, his shotgun booming as he engaged targets that had been exposed by Duke's charge. The old lawman might have been approaching retirement, but his aim was still deadly accurate, and his knowledge of the ranch's layout gave him tactical advantages that the assault team couldn't overcome. But the federal vehicles were still 60 seconds away, and Crowley's team was regrouping for a final assault that would overwhelm the ranch's defenders through sheer firepower. The original deed to Cedar Falls was still in Jed's jacket, still unproven in a court of law, and still vulnerable to being lost if the next minute didn't go according to plan. As Jed prepared for what might be his final stand, he thought about his parents and the price they had paid to gather the evidence that could finally bring justice to Cedar Falls. The territorial deed was more than just a legal document. It was proof that an entire community had been robbed of its heritage by people who believed that money and power placed them above the law. The battle for the McAllister Ranch was about to reach its climax, and the outcome would determine whether truth would finally triumph or whether another generation would fall victim to the same conspiracy that had already claimed too many lives. The complete evidence cache, every document, photograph, certificate, and piece of correspondence that Edward and Catherine McAllister had gathered over decades of investigation lay secured in the reinforced steel container that Jed now carried toward the approaching federal vehicles. The weight of it was substantial, but not nearly as heavy as the responsibility it represented. Duke's heroic charge had bought them the crucial seconds they needed. The horse had taken down 3 of Crowley's operatives before tactical training and superior firepower had forced him to retreat, but not before disrupting their coordinated assault long enough for the FBI vehicles to close the final distance to the ranch. The federal agents emerged from their vehicles with the practiced efficiency of people who had conducted similar operations many times before, but their arrival transformed the tactical situation completely. Crowley's team found themselves caught between Jed's defensive position at the house and a superior federal force that had surrounded their vehicles and escape routes. Special Agent Sarah Chen, the lead federal investigator, had been working the conspiracy case for more than a decade, following leads that had been provided by Uncle Thomas Morrison and other sources within the government. Her arrival at the McAllister Ranch represented the culmination of an investigation that had begun long before Jed had discovered the first gold certificate in the barn. Mr. Crowley. Agent Chen's voice carried the authority of federal law enforcement as she addressed the developer through her vehicle's public address system. You and your associates are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, fraud, and violation of federal statutes regarding mineral rights theft. Surrender your weapons and submit to arrest immediately. Crowley's response was to order his remaining operatives to intensify their assault on the house, apparently believing that eliminating Jed and the evidence would somehow allow him to escape federal prosecution. But his tactical situation was hopeless, and his desperation was leading him to make increasingly poor decisions. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Federal agents with superior training, equipment, and tactical positioning systematically dismantled Crowley's resistance, while Jed and Sheriff Cole maintained their defensive positions. Within 10 minutes, 5 of Crowley's operatives were in custody. 2 others were receiving medical attention for wounds sustained during Duke's charge, and 1 had been killed while attempting to destroy evidence in his vehicle. Marcus Crowley Jr. himself surrendered only when Agent Chen made it clear that continued resistance would result in additional federal charges that could result in the death penalty. His expensive tactical gear was stripped away to reveal a man who looked nothing like the confident developer who had visited the ranch just days earlier. The facade of legitimate business had crumbled to reveal the criminal underneath. But the most significant moment came when Agent Chen examined the complete evidence cache that Jed presented to her. The collection of documents, photographs, and certificates told a story that exceeded even the federal investigators' expectations. What they had suspected was a regional conspiracy involving a few corrupt officials had revealed itself as a national scandal reaching into the highest levels of government and industry. The original territorial deed was the keystone that held everything together, proving that the legal foundation for decades of mineral extraction had been fraudulent from the beginning. But the supporting documents revealed a pattern of corruption that involved senators, cabinet officials, and corporate executives who had profited from the systematic theft of public resources. This is extraordinary, Agent Chen said as she catalogued each piece of evidence with the care due to historical artifacts. Your parents documented everything: financial transactions, communications between conspirators, photographic evidence of meetings that were supposed to be secret. This cache represents one of the most comprehensive exposures of government corruption in American history. Duke had survived the firefight with minor injuries, but his role in the victory had been crucial. The horse's trained response to the threat had disrupted Crowley's tactical advantage at the most critical moment, allowing federal law enforcement to arrive before the evidence could be destroyed. As Agent Chen watched Duke receive medical attention from a federal veterinarian, she shook her head in amazement. "Your father trained him specifically for this scenario, didn't he?" she asked Jed. "Every behavior we witnessed tonight was part of a coordinated defense plan that was decades in the making." As dawn broke over the McAllister ranch, the scope of what had been accomplished became clear. Crowley's arrest was just the beginning. The evidence cache would fuel investigations that would expose corruption in multiple federal agencies, bring down mining executives who had built fortunes on stolen resources, and provide legal grounds for returning mineral rights to the communities that had been defrauded. But perhaps more importantly, the truth about Cedar Falls would finally be told. The families who had been driven from their homes by economic manipulation would learn that their suffering had been deliberately caused by people who profited from their misery. The young people who had left the valley believing there was no future there would discover that their heritage included mineral wealth worth millions of dollars. Sheriff Cole, who had fought alongside Jed throughout the night, summed up the victory in characteristically direct terms. "Your parents didn't die for nothing, son. They died to make this moment possible." As federal agents continued to process the crime scene and catalog evidence, Jed found himself standing beside Duke, near the old barn, where the mystery had begun. The horse's vigil was finally over, his duty fulfilled after decades of patient waiting. The secret that had driven his nightly watch was no longer hidden, and the justice his training had been designed to protect was finally being served. Agent Chen approached them as the morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold that seemed to echo the certificates that had started everything. "There will be trials, Mr. McAllister, lots of them, and we'll need your testimony about everything you discovered and everyone you spoke with during your investigation." "I'll be there," Jed replied without hesitation. "My parents sacrificed everything for this moment. I'm not going to let their sacrifice be wasted." The complete evidence cache was loaded into federal vehicles for transport to secure facilities where teams of investigators would spend months unraveling the full scope of the conspiracy. But copies of the most important documents would remain with Jed, ensuring that the story of what had happened to Cedar Falls would be preserved for future generations. As the federal convoy prepared to leave the ranch, taking Marcus Crowley Jr. and his surviving associates to face justice, Duke walked to his old watching position beside the barn. But instead of the tense vigilance that had characterized his behavior for so many weeks, the horse simply stood peacefully, his duty finally complete. The battle for the McAllister Ranch was over, but the war for justice had just begun. The evidence that Edward and Catherine McAllister had died to protect would now fuel investigations that would restore stolen wealth to communities throughout the region and ensure that similar conspiracies could never operate with the same impunity. Jed looked out over the land that 3 generations of his family had worked and protected, land that was now secure not just for him, but for the community that would be rebuilt with the resources that were rightfully theirs. The long night was over, and morning had finally come to Cedar Falls. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Jed stood in the newly renovated Cedar Falls Community Center, holding the document that would secure his town's future for generations to come. The new town charter, printed on heavy paper that bore the official seals of both the state of Colorado and the Federal Bureau of Land Management, It established the Cedar Falls Community Trust, a legal entity that would manage the mineral rights and development funds that had been restored to their rightful owners. The charter represented more than just legal recognition of the community's rights. It was a promise that the wealth extracted from beneath their land would be used to rebuild what had been destroyed, to attract new families to the valley, and to ensure that no outside interests could ever again manipulate the town's economic future for their own benefit. The community center itself stood as testament to what could be accomplished when justice was finally served. Built with funds from the first mineral rights settlements, it occupied the site where Marcus Crowley Sr.'s fraudulent development office had once promised prosperity while planning the community's destruction. The irony was not lost on anyone who remembered those bitter years of false hope and broken dreams. Martha Henley, now in her early 80s but still sharp as the autumn wind, had been elected as the Trust's first chairwoman, a role that recognized both her decades of service to the community and her unwavering faith that Cedar Falls would someday reclaim its heritage. She stood beside Jed as he signed the charter, her weathered hands steady as she added her own signature to the historic document. "Your parents would be so proud," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of memories that spanned decades. They knew this day would come, even when the rest of us had given up hope. The legal proceedings that had followed Crowley's arrest had exceeded everyone's expectations. Federal investigators, armed with the evidence that Edward and Catherine McAllister had gathered over decades, had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into multiple states and involved corruption at the highest levels of government. Senators had resigned in disgrace, cabinet officials had been indicted, and mining executives who had built empires on stolen resources faced prison sentences that would keep them behind bars for the rest of their lives. But more importantly for Cedar Falls, the courts had ruled that all mineral extraction from the valley since 1960 had been conducted without legal authority. The mining companies were required to pay restitution that totaled more than $50 million, funds that would be administered by the Community Trust to ensure maximum benefit for current and future residents. Doc Harrison, now serving as the Trust's medical advisor, had used part of the initial settlement to establish a clinic that would serve not just Cedar Falls, but the entire surrounding region. Young doctors, attracted by loan forgiveness programs funded by the Trust, were already arriving to staff the facility and provide medical care that hadn't been available locally for more than 30 years. Sheriff Cole had decided to postpone his retirement to oversee the expansion of law enforcement services that the growing community would require. The Trust had funded the hiring of additional deputies and the construction of a proper police station that would ensure Cedar Falls never again fell victim to outside manipulation and intimidation. But perhaps the most visible sign of the town's transformation was the return of families who had left the valley during the dark years of economic decline. Young couples, drawn by affordable housing and guaranteed employment in trust-funded projects, were buying and renovating homes that had stood empty for decades. The school that had been closed for lack of students was being rebuilt with facilities that would provide education comparable to any urban district. Eleanor Watts, the retired schoolteacher who had helped Jed research his family's history, had been appointed as the Trust's historical coordinator. Her first project was the establishment of a museum that would tell the complete story of what had happened to Cedar Falls, not just the years of decline and corruption, but the investigation that had ultimately brought justice and the people who had sacrificed everything to ensure the truth would survive. The centerpiece of the museum would be the original territorial deed, displayed alongside the gold certificates and other evidence that had exposed the conspiracy. But equally prominent would be photographs of Edward and Catherine McAllister, recognition of their courage and the price they had paid to protect their community's future. Duke, now recognized as a local hero whose actions had been crucial to the victory over Crowley's forces, had become something of a celebrity throughout the region. Veterinary students from the state university regularly visited the ranch to study his training and behavior, marveling at the sophistication of the conditioning program that Edward McAllister had developed over decades. But despite his fame, Duke seemed most content when he was simply being a horse, grazing peacefully in pastures that were now secure from any threat of seizure or development. His nightly vigils had ended with the exposure of the secrets he had guarded so faithfully, and his behavior had returned to the normal patterns of an aging ranch horse who had earned his retirement. On this particular evening, as Jed walked through the center of a town that was alive with activity for the first time in decades, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with Duke's mysterious behavior at the barn, had led through layers of family secrets and historical injustices, and had culminated in a confrontation that had changed not just Cedar Falls, but the entire region. The restored mineral rights were generating revenue that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Young entrepreneurs, attracted by trust-funded business development programs, were opening shops and restaurants that served both local residents and the increasing number of tourists who came to learn about the town's remarkable transformation. The evening air carried sounds that hadn't been heard in Cedar Falls for 30 years, children playing in yards, families gathering for dinner, neighbors visiting across fence lines that no longer divided struggling survivors but connected members of a thriving community. The silence of decline had been replaced by the comfortable noise of people building lives in a place they could trust to support their dreams. As Jed returned to the ranch, he found Duke waiting by the gate with the patient contentment of an animal whose life's work had been completed successfully. The horse no longer watched the barn with the intensity that had characterized his behavior for so many months, but he still maintained the alertness of a guardian who understood the value of what he protected. The barn itself had been restored and converted into a community meeting space where town business was conducted with the transparency that had been missing during the dark years of outside manipulation. The location was symbolic. Where secrets had once been hidden, public decisions were now made openly, with full participation from everyone whose lives would be affected. That night, as Jed sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and watched the lights of a revitalized Cedar Falls twinkling in the valley below, he felt the deep satisfaction that comes from honoring a trust that has been passed down through generations. His parents' sacrifice had not been in vain, and the evidence they had gathered at the cost of their lives had finally served its intended purpose. Duke approached the porch and rested his head against the railing, his dark eyes reflecting the wisdom of an animal who had participated in something far greater than himself. The bond between man and horse had deepened through their shared experience of danger and victory, creating a partnership that transcended the normal relationships between species. The trust charter that Jed had signed that day guaranteed that Cedar Falls would never again be vulnerable to the kind of exploitation that had once threatened its existence. Future generations would inherit not just the mineral wealth that lay beneath their land, but the knowledge of how that wealth had been stolen and recovered, ensuring that the lessons of history would never be forgotten. As the stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Jed thought about the letter his mother had written decades earlier, the words that had revealed the true scope of the conspiracy and provided the roadmap for exposing it. Sometimes the hardest thing about doing what's right is finding the courage to begin, she had written, and her wisdom had proven itself true in ways that even she might not have anticipated. The courage to begin had led to the courage to continue, and the courage to continue had led to justice for a community that had waited too long for the truth to be told. The McAllister Ranch was no longer just a piece of land, worked by one family. It was the foundation upon which an entire community had rebuilt its future, and the symbol of what could be accomplished when people refused to accept that power and corruption would always triumph over truth and justice. The long vigil was over, The secrets had been revealed, and the future that Edward and Catherine McAllister had envisioned for Cedar Falls was finally beginning to unfold. Duke's watch was finished, but the legacy he had helped protect would endure for generations to come.